You're listening to the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.
We've got a series of Mishnayot. It's a chain of Mishnayot. It runs for about 3 chapters. And they all begin with the words ha-mucher, someone who sells, or someone who sold. I've translated sold here, but it really should be someone who sells. And we did take a little bit of a diversion at the end of the 5th chapter, with the stories about cleaning out the scales and cleaning out the measuring vessels, and the guy who sent his or her child to the shop to buy oil, and the oil was smashed and the change was lost. So we've taken a little bit of a diversion, but we are still in principle in this chain of Mishnayot. Ha-mucher, someone who sells. And the Mishnah seems very, very interested in this subject, because maybe I just reflects the fact that buying and selling is a core human activity. But we've got three chapters analyzing all kinds of different situations, from selling a house to selling a field. And now we're going to get into selling things which are intrinsically, let's say, wastable, perishable. What if we sell something which is intrinsically perishable? Who is responsible? Who is responsible for the damage? So now, entering the 6th chapter of Bava Batra with perishable items, ha-mucher perot lechavero, someone who sold, fruit or produce or grain, lechavero, to his fellow. Again, we've got the social relationship between the buyer and the seller. We're not in the anonymous, litigious world. So there is a relationship, and there should be some give and take on both sides. We saw when we were discussing the measures that actually the seller is generous on measures. He gives a little bit more to make the scales weigh down. But in this situation, we're going to restrict the liability of the seller. Ha-mucher perot lechavero, someone who sells produce to his fellow, velo tzimechu, and they don't sprout. They don't sprout. So you bought some grain in the marketplace, you've taken it back to your garden and you planted it, and it doesn't sprout. And of course, there's an immediate question. Well, was the grain suitable for eating or suitable for planting? Have you bought seeds, or have you bought food? And people talk about seed corn. Seed corn is not necessarily the same quality as corn for eating. And it seems in this situation as if the seller hasn't specified. So, as in most of the Mishnayot we're discussing, the contract doesn't specify whether this is seed corn or eating corn. And in that situation, it seems that the seller is not responsible. Velosime, who they didn't sprout, afilu zera pishtan eino chayav ba'achariyutan. He's not responsible, even if it was flax. And of course, flax is a classic example where usually we don't eat it. There are some people that have flax for breakfast, but mostly flax is sold for seed. But the mostly doesn't help in this situation. The contract doesn't specify that it was for selling, for seeding, and so the seller's not responsible. Now, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel is going to firm up a little bit on the definitions. He's going to be more precise. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, Zerone gina, if they were garden seeds, so they seem to be sold as garden seeds. Maybe in London, we have things called garden centres, and you can walk into them and buy seeds in coloured packets. Those are clearly garden seeds. They're meant to be sown. So Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, Zerone gina, garden seeds, as if they had a garden centre or a seller of seeds in those days, she'enan ne'echalin, which are not eaten. These are kind of seeds that are not eaten. So, for example, a foxglove in the UK makes a fat seed which you might sell for sowing, but is absolutely not edible. It's absolutely not edible. And in this case, chayavin ba'achariyutan. At this point, he is responsible for the consequences. And by the way, that might mean the cost of planting and taking care of them, as well as just the cost of the seeds themselves. Achariyutan, he's responsible for what happens next. Hamocher, let's keep going. Hamocher perot lachavero. Someone is selling produce or grain to his fellow. Hareze mekabel alav rova tinofet lisea. If someone sells grain, he's going to accept a quarter. This must be a quarter kav, by the way. The Gemara makes this clear. It's a quarter kav of tinofet. Tinofet's a rude word. It's rubbish. It's crap. It's stuff left at the bottom of the barrel. He accepts a quarter kav of rubbish with every seah. Now, 6 kav make a seah. So if there's a quarter kav of rubbish in the grain, and we can imagine, by the way, we're harvesting in the time of the Mishnah by hand, and we're threshing by hand. So there is going to be rubbish mixed in with the grain. I mean, that's, by the way, why we check our grains on Pesach. We might have something like rice, but we still check it because there might be something else in it. We're going to accept a quarter kav of rubbish with every seah, so that if 6 kav make a seah, that's 1 in 24. So that's approximately 4. That is approximately 4%. We're essentially accepting 4% wastage. That's understood. Te'enim b'kabel eser matliot la'mea. If they're figs, he accepts 10 worm-eaten ones for every 100. And we know, by the way, figs they've got soft skins. They're really attractive to worms. Even if you grow them in your own garden, they're attractive to worms. Martef shel yain. If it's a cellar of wine, a cellar that is a storehouse below the ground, not a cellar in the sense of someone who sells. If there's a cellar loaded with wine, makabel alav eser kosasot lemea. If it's a cellar of wine, he accepts 10 sour jars in every 100. That's 10%. But again, they did not have that's very high error rate for today's technology, but they did not have glass. At least they were not. They did have glass probably, but they're not storing wine in glass jugs in the time of the Mishnah. They're storing it in clay jugs, and so and of course the cork is not as high tech as the cork today. So oxygen is getting in. Perhaps it's not surprising that their failure rate is more like 10%, 10 in 100. And as for the jugs themselves, kinkenim, jugs. Bas Sharon. Sharon is, so that we're essentially in the plains in the north of Israel. If he buys jugs, makabel alav eser potsot lemea, he accepts 10 which are, well, I've translated this here as brittle, although Jastrow suggests that it's not dried out properly. It's not fired properly. There's something about these, and Jastrow actually says, oh yeah, they drip. Bartanura says that the wine will sort of leak out of them. But essentially, we're saying that the manufacturing process for clay jars also had an error rate of about 1 in 10, about 10 in 100. And if you buy 100 jugs, you're buying wholesale, you do not expect that all of them are perfectly fired. And that means, by the way, that if the wine is good, but then turns sour later, perhaps the seller is not responsible. Someone who's selling wine to his fellow, and it turns into vinegar. It turns sour. He's not actually responsible for the consequences in general. But if he knew that his wine tended to go sour, in other words, he knows this is a problem with his wine, At that point, hareze mekach ta'ut. This is a mistaken purchase. Essentially, he's not made the proper disclosures. Mekach ta'ut is it's a mistaken purchase. It's an erroneous purchase. Essentially, the buyer can reverse the whole deal. The buyer can say, I didn't know that I was buying wine that regularly turns sour. I want to reverse the transaction. If he said to him, I'm selling you spiced wine, this seems to be some kind of wine that you would cook gently, but it's got spices in it. And of course, we know that the spices make it more liable to go off, particularly in the hot months. He's liable to the point that it lasts until Shavuot. In other words, spiced wine is considered to last through the winter. Shavuot is basically the beginning of the hot season. So if it's spiced, it should normally last through the winter, but after the hot season begins, there are no guarantees. If he says it's old, yashan, in other words, if he said to him, this is yashan, if he says it's old wine, Michel Eshtekad. Eshtekad seems to be a contraction of Shata Kadma'a, the last year. Shata is Aramaic for Shana, and Kadma'a is Aramaic for Kedem, before. So Michel Eshtekad is last years. If he says, I'm selling you old wine, it has to be at least from last year's. If he says Meyushan, that's sort of aged or matured. That's a little bit more than Yashan. It's properly aged. If he says it's Meyushan, it's aged, Mishalosh Shanim. It must be from 3 years. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean 3 years old, but it means essentially not this year's, not last year's, but it could have been from the year before last. So 1 to 3 years, even though not necessarily 3 full years. If you say you're selling yain meyushan, aged wine, there have to be at least essentially 3. The calendar has to have 3 years in it. Otherwise, you're deceiving your buyers. Interestingly, the obligation of the seller for wine that doesn't turn sour is restricted by Maimonides, and we've got this just at the end of the source sheet, to when it's in the buyer's own vessels. In other words, if the buyer puts it in his own casks, the seller is not responsible. But it seems as if the seller sells the wine with the casks, so the seller says, look, here's the wine and here's the casks for it. At this point, the seller has got more responsibility. And we can kind of imagine that today. If we're buying wine from a seller with a bottle, we assume that the wine and the bottle together are essentially fit for purpose.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.